Good evening all, and welcome. Tonight, we're going to be venturing into nursing homes, a new topic that I have never done before, so I hope you all enjoy. It's time to get comfortable, put on your nurse's outfit, and let the darkness take control. 5 years ago, I worked as a CNA at an Eastern Tennessee nursing home. Not for me. I had a resident named Helen, who upon getting my hall assignment, was told by my hall partner that they all believed her to be possessed. Ha, right, whatever. First off, I'm not religious. Second of all, I've seen too many elderly folks acting crazy by the grace of Father Time. That's the Bible Belt for you. So I just smiled and nodded, because why be rude? Helen turned out to be one of the more difficult residents, to say the least. She was wheelchair-bound and could scoot herself up and down the hall, muttering to herself, and sometimes, without warning, she would attack someone close to her, be it a fellow resident, staff, or visitor, clawing, hitting, and kicking, until she was pulled off the bewildered person. She did have incredible strength when these attacks happened, and she would growl these deep, guttural growls the whole time. We ended up having to keep her isolated in a room alone, with her wheelchair locked to keep the other residents safe. A few months into the job, I switched to night shift on the same hall, because the shift differential was a little over $1 more on the hour. I was told by the night shift nurse that Helen was just as much a handful at night as she was during the day. One night, while I was walking down the hall to do my midnight vitals, I smelled the familiar stench of fecal matter when I stopped by Helen's room. I thought maybe evening shift left a dirty adult diaper in the trash can, as they sometimes do it if they're in a rush to get through their end-of-shift dry routine. The trash cans are right by the inside of the doors, so that the housekeepers can easily reach in and empty them. I stuck my head in the room, and by the light from the hall I could see the trash can was empty, but the stench was unmistakable and very strong. I stepped into the room and paused. I could hear Helen's raspy, low muttering. It creeped me out more than usual because on night shift there was only one CNA per hall. I was alone. The nurse was at the nurse's station. It was dark in there, and Helen was awake. Her bathroom was to the left of her door, so I reached in and turned the light on. I was horrified at what I saw when I stepped past the bathroom and came in view of Helen's bed. She lay there on her backside facing me with her bony hand. She was wiping her own feces on the wall, but there was red mixed with the brown. After calling the nurse, the two of us discovered she hadn't just played in the bowel movement she made in her adult diaper. She had dug it out of herself, ripping the thin, delicate anal tissue in the process, wiping the poop, bloody mixture all over the wall. She never made out like she felt any of it. We had to start restraining her through the night. Another night, a new charge nurse had gotten assigned to my hall. In the mornings before day shift started, the nurse had to give all morning meds. I warned her not to interact with Helen unless I was with her. "That little bitty old thing?" she asked. "She can't be more than 85 pounds soaking wet." 87.5, I said. "And it takes 5 CNAs to bathe her." She looked at me like she didn't believe me, but agreed to let me know before she medicated her. Right before I started my end-of-shift charting, the nurse told me she was ready to administer Helen's meds. I nodded, stood up, and followed her into Helen's room, where she still lay restrained. I went to get a pair of gloves from the dispenser, but they were empty. I turned to the nurse and said, "I'll run to the stockroom for a box of gloves. "Don't touch her until I return." I saw the nurse's eyes roll as I exited the room. Coming back from the stockroom, I heard cries of help ringing down my hall. The CNA from the adjacent hall was already running towards the sound, and I followed. The source was the ever-doubting newbie nurse who had undone the wrist straps of the sweet old lady and was now being clawed at. She had a hand full of her hair from the back of her head and was digging her fingers into her throat, which were all scratched up and starting to bleed. Helen was screaming in a guttural rasp, "We hate you." It took me, the other CNA, and another nurse to pry Helen's fingers off my nurse and restrain her again. The nurse from the other hall was cleaning my nurse's wounds while I took down the incident report. She said through sobs that after I left, Helen spoke to her in a sweet voice, told her good morning and smiled at her. She asked if she wouldn't mind helping her go to the bathroom. Helen was incontinent and hadn't used a toilet in over a year. The nurse told her that of course she would and removed the wrist restraints, when Helen suddenly pounced. She cried harder, saying her voice, even the smell of her, completely changed. I charted the nurse had deep lacerations to her throat and was missing a patch of hair. Helen had ripped it from her skull. She quit that night. There were many other instances, and I became terrified of caring for that woman. The worst happened on my last night working at the nursing home. I was about to leave. I had already clocked out, but remembered I needed to tell the day shift CNAs about a resident having an out-of-facility doctor appointment, that one of them would need to have to ride with them. I spotted them down the hall and called out to them walking in their direction. I was passing Helen's room, did a double take and stopped dead in my tracks. Day shift had already gotten Helen up and in her wheelchair. It was in locked position in the middle of her room, but she'd somehow had gotten one of her hands free from the restraint and was chewing the index finger of said hand. It was all a blur. I screamed something. I ran into the room and the day shifter nurse ran with me. It took all of us to wrestle her finger out of her mouth. She was screaming in protest and growling the whole time. Mouth of yellow and jagged teeth covered in blood and bits of flesh. Helen had chewed the meat off most of her right index finger. The doctor was called in, and he said he'd never seen anything like it, and she would need skin graft surgery. It was more than I could take. I walked out of the nursing home and never returned. I didn't give any notice either. I didn't even call. I remained traumatized by Helen and never worked as a CNA again. A few years ago, I was working a night shift on a generic rehabilitation ward in an old hospital that since closed down. The ward was a long L-shaped corridor with the nurses' station situated at the bend. I was doing some paperwork at the nurses' station, and the other nurse on duty was on her break, sitting in the lounge at the end of the corridor. Out of nowhere, I heard this almighty crash from one of the bedrooms, and I shot straight up and started running towards it. My colleague was coming down the corridor towards me, as we had both assumed that the gentleman in one of the single beds had fallen out of the bed. The man in this room was still fast asleep in bed, and his sensor mat told us that he had not gotten up. In the middle of the room lay his bedside cabinet, face down on the ground. Further across from that, the drawer from it was against the floor, the wall across from where the cabinet usually faced. We didn't really know what to make of it, so I picked up the cabinet and put the drawer back in. We woke the man up and asked him if he had thrown it, but he was as confused as we were. Realistically, he couldn't have moved it anyway. It was quite heavy, and he was pretty frail, needing help to even mobilize. It's not possible that another patient had been in the room, as we did a round immediately after, and everyone was in bed. No one had been in the corridor prior to this happening. For the next few weeks, I felt really uncomfortable being in that room, even the day duties, and was so glad when the hospital closed down, as it meant I got to move to a brand newly built one. I work night shift in a hospital as a caregiver. Part of my job entails watching over disoriented and confused patients, and ones that are approaching death. I am working in the medical ward, so we have a lot of elderly patients with dementia and/or Alzheimer's. A few nights ago, we admitted a very tiny old lady of 91 with pneumonia. She is completely blind but totally mobile, and her mind is still crystal clear. She used to be an English teacher, and her whole personality and the way she speaks, as well as her vocabulary and pronunciation, attests to that. A very stubborn, independent, and strong-willed lady. I was assigned to take care of her for the night, as she was not familiar with the layout of the room, and would walk into things trying to find the bathroom and possibly injure herself. It went well for the first few hours. We chatted about stuff until about 11, when I said she must try to get some sleep. I'm sitting right by her side, and she can just say if she needs anything. She agrees, turns over and makes herself comfortable. After a while she's fiddling with the blankets and being restless, I lean over to her to switch on the dim bedside light to see how I can help her. When she says to me, "Oh, you have the most beautiful blue eyes." While I'm trying to figure out how this blind lady knows I have blue eyes and how to respond, she continues, "And while you're up, please get an extra blanket for the little boy that's sitting on my bed. His skin is cold as ice." As if there's nothing weird about it. I immediately got a cold shiver down my back, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. As if that wasn't enough, the call bell in the bathroom in the room started ringing without anyone being there. I switched the bell off and told her that I would be back now with a blanket, and went to ask a colleague to relieve me and take a blanket in. Everything, I'm sure, can be rationally explained away, but as I'm fascinated by the paranormal, I found this experience chilling and wanted to share it. Lots of weird stuff happens at the hospital, especially at night, and it's easy to get creeped out when alone in the dark with a dying or disoriented patient. At the age of 18, I got my first CNA job, working at a care facility. The job was night shift. One night, after our rounds were finished, me and a co-worker were sitting at the nurse's station telling ghost stories. One of our longtime residents was a notorious gossip, Dave, and decides to chip in and tells about a little girl who haunts the second floor. At the time, the second and third floors had both been closed for years. He finished the story by telling us she plays with a ball, and if you're quiet and listen, you can hear the ball bounce. Right at the moment he finishes his story, a call light for a resident goes off. A resident who I've never seen use her call light before or since. When I go into her room to check on her, she's laying in her bed with a terrified look on her face pointing at the ceiling. I was a little freaked out, but easily reasoned it away. I did, however, tell the story to my sister. 4 years later, I'm now working day shift in the same building, and the second and third floors have been renovated and are now house sub-acute care patients. These patients are mostly surgery recovery and will go home after their stay. My sister is also working there as a CNA, and I work the third floor and she the second. One Sunday afternoon, she comes to me with a pale face and wide eyes, and proceeds to tell me, "You know, Carrie, I went into her room for last rounds and asked her if she needed anything before I left. She looked over me all happy and said she had the most wonderful day watching that girl play. I looked at her in puzzlement and asked her which girl. The one playing with her ball, she's so sweet. My sister looks at me in the eyes and says, I've been up and down that hall all day and haven't seen any kids visiting. Of course, we both remember the story from years before, but come now, it's simply a coincidence, right? Also, Carrie died that very night. I worked at a forensic state facility that housed mentally disabled men who were unable to stand trial. My shift was from 9:30 p.m. to 6:30 a.m. I thought it was funny that a lot of my co-workers were into the ghost stories, but I learnt real quick that all you could do was laugh at things you couldn't explain. One night I was sitting in a chair in the doorway of my one-to-one client. His room was the last room of the hallway near the exit door, so it was dark on that side of the hall when the lights were off. I had seen a dark sort of figure under the exit sign that was placed above the exit door. I stared at it for about a minute, trying to register what I was actually seeing, before I could get through my head that this was something unusual. The figure rushed towards me, causing me to jump and fall out of my chair. I laughed because I thought I looked silly on camera, as there were cameras covering every inch of the hallway. I also joked with other co-workers, saying I was part of the ghost story gang. That same night I was in the chart room at around 4:30 a.m. to file observation notes of the residents in the chart book. The books were really heavy and weren't easy to tote around. After I filled all the charts, as we had 12 residents on my home, and put the books back on the shelf, they flew off the shelf as they were being thrown and landed in the middle of the room. At that time, I was more upset than concerned, because it was a long and hellish night, and I had to just put those books up. There were other instances when I had seen things I couldn't explain. One instance was when I had seen a headless figure standing at the end of the hallway, the same spot where I had seen that shadow. I thought it was a resident at first because he was wearing a white t-shirt, blue basketball shorts and white sneakers. He resembled another resident who lived on a different home, as he was the only individual on campus that was close to 7 foot and nearly 400 pounds. I walked towards it calling the individual's name, but got no reaction from the figure. I looked down to get my break room key from my pocket because I thought the resident needed something to drink, and we often had the good stuff. When I looked up, the figure was gone. There were other times when the shadows would be out, and I noticed it was usually when our residents were asleep in the room most of the night. I told my new co-worker about all I have seen on my home, and she laughed, saying I was just as crazy as the other people on the night shift. The next night after that conversation, she was to work a shift on her own. After that night, she demanded to be moved to another home. I was curious about her transfer and went to read the observation and home notes from the last night she worked. It said 4:30 a.m., all residents asleep in their beds throughout the night. I guess they didn't like the new girl's sense of humor. I worked permanent night shifts in a large care home for 2.5 years. It was a really old house that had been converted and had bits added onto it. Often it sometimes buzzed in the night and would wake up at least one other person who would usually want the toilet, a drink, or think it was the time to wake. Our duties involved helping people to bed, then some lights, cleaning the laundry, and we stayed as quiet as we could in order not to wake anyone. Every now and then, we would have several people all buzz within 2 minutes of each other, asking us to tell the children to stop running around and playing outside, and asked why they were up so late and where their parents were. This was only on one side of the building, Several other staff members believed it to be haunted as well. This happened to my grandmother, and she swears up and down that what you are about to hear is true. Many years ago, she had an accident, as old ladies often do, and ended up breaking her hip. She had to be taken to the hospital, and it turned out that she had several problems with her, and that it would take a long time for her to heal. Most of the healing needed to be done in the hospital in order to monitor her and assure she was receiving the proper care, and finally, a care home, a sort of intermediary between hospital and home, before she could finally be discharged. I went to visit her a few times, and the conditions were appalling. There were so many people crammed into such small wards. The air was toxic and suffocating, and I knew my grandmother wasn't enjoying it. However, it wasn't before long that she was moved to a much nicer, far more comfortable place in the care home. I went to visit her there one afternoon and asked her how her day was, brought her some snacks, some flowers, and tried to cheer her up. I spoke with her all afternoon about all kinds of things, and just as I'm about to leave, she grabs my hand and looks at me in the eye. "Don't go," she says. "There's something I've been meaning to tell you, but I keep putting it off because I think I'm going mad." I give her a little smile and tell her it's all right and that I'll always believe her. Probably. She looks around to see who's looking and hearing. Thankfully, there was no one else in the room at the time as she was sitting up in bed. She squeezes my hand tightly and beckons me to come closer, and I do. She says, "There's a little girl who comes and plays in here at night. I don't know if she's one of the workers' children or something, but she's always here. She wakes me up when she skips across the room. She picks up things and puts them back like any curious child, and after a few minutes, I hear her singing gently in the corridor and then disappear." I look at her and ask, "Is that all?" And she nods, but then says, "She's here every night at the same time, 2 a.m. My grandma is a very light sleeper, and at first I told her that it was all right and that it was probably just a member of staff who had a child or something, trying my best to convince her. But my grandmother is no fool, and looked at me in the eye and said, "I think we both know what's going on here." And she was right. We were both confident it was a ghost. But I told her not to worry, and that it might not come back, for she was quite frightened of it. So she ignored it and carried on as I left. I don't visit her for 2 days due to work, and when I come back, I again strike up a conversation with her. She tells me all about how she's excited that she's going to leave, as she's been given permission to leave next week, and she was incredibly anxious to go home. Again, just before I leave, does she squeeze my hand and tell me again that the little ghost girl had returned, but then more curiously, that my jacket had disappeared. She said that when she woke up at the sound of the little ghost girl, that this time she looked at her dead in the eye and just carried on skipping away. The thing is, I left my jacket on a chair next to my grandmother's bed, and when she woke up next morning it had been gone. She asked all of the day and night staff if they had moved it, but none of them seemed to be able to locate it. The days were ticking along quickly, and although I myself wasn't that concerned with the disappearance of my coat, as it was old and worn, My grandmother, with very little to do, had made it her mission to find what had happened to it. She was semi-mobile, as she had one of those frames, and she started scooting around the place, looking up and down, trying to find desperately where this coat was, which was very ill-advised according to the nurses. She didn't find it, but the day before she left, she was growing increasingly annoyed and got in a bad temper with the nurses, saying that they must have moved it and not forgotten, and even accused one of them of stealing it. When she fell asleep, she awoke as usual to the sound of footsteps skipping across the floor. She opened her eyes and saw the little girl quickly dart past the door of her room, and just as she was about to close her eyes again, did she notice my coat resting gently on the chair. She was convinced that either the ghost girl had moved it and was returning it to her before her departure, or she had found where it had been lost and was giving it back. In any case, my grandmother thought it was a very nice gesture, and was happy and calm with the ghost girl for one last time. She left the next day, her health improved, and to this day she is still fine. But the question in my mind remained about these strange happenings. So about a year later, when I had some free time, I decided to look into the place where this hospital care home was. It turns out that in 1910, this was a school that operated in the area. It wasn't until the Second World War that this school was hit by a bomb. Although there were no kids here when it happened, there was a family that lived next to the school, and all of the inhabitants of that house perished. I came to find out that a family of 4, a son, a daughter, and a mother and father, had all lived there and died. I know the girl was around 10 years old and the son about 3, so it's likely in my head that the girl could have attended the school very next door to her home, and that this is where she chooses to haunt, as it must be where she spent many an hour and fun times during her brief life on this plane. Little ghost girl, thanks for getting me my coat back. I hope you have a safe and peaceful existence. I work in maintenance in a hospital, but this story comes from out of work hours. Back in November, my grandfather passed away. He had been living in a care home for several years now, and as we were from a smaller city, his main care aide was actually an ex's mother who I am still close to. Nearing his final days, she texted me that things weren't looking good, and to get my mum, who works out of town, and myself, to see him ASAP. The next 2 nights were exhaustive. Her and I barely left his bedside. We were wetting his lips, rubbing his head, and singing Charlie Pride, and telling him stories from my childhood and from my mum's. At one point, Is Anybody Going to San Antonio comes on the CD player, and Mum tears up, talking about how this song reminds her of her father the most. He wasn't really coherent besides a glimmering moment in the first day we got there, and by the final day we were sitting watching the breaths turn to choke breaths. As the hours got nearer, my ex's mum was contacted and came in on her day off to sit with us for that final hour. My mum had her father's head in her lap, and we still had Charlie Pride on the radio. She was whispering in her ear to stop being stubborn, and that she could take care of her brothers, and that she had me to take care of her. The gaps got longer and longer in his breaths. My ex's mum was sitting next to me, the CD player behind us, and my mum laying on the opposite side of the care home bed. All of a sudden, his breathing stops, and in that moment so did the CD player. It hadn't skipped once the whole weekend. My mum figured Tyreen had turned it off, starting to sob, assuming it was to signify he was officially gone. I sat and looked at Tyreen like, did that just happen? And after a good 20 seconds out of nowhere he took a shuddery breath, and the CD scrambled forward. And the song just before Is Anyone Going to San Antonio? Not sure if that's the name of the song, but it was about not wanting to miss someone, started playing. And then he was gone by the end of San Antonio, the song that Mum remembered him most by. Tyreen mentioned odd things happen more often than not as a person finally passes. "10 years ago, I started working as a CNA in a care home for the elderly. There was a guy who I really got along with, Brian. He was easily my favorite guy to hang around with, and being the only dudes here, we quickly struck up a very strong friendship. He was a great guy, caring, compassionate, and looked after all his patients. He told me a lot of stories about this place, as he had joined straight out of his teens and absolutely loved working here. Stories of spectral figures haunting the hallways, of nights where the cameras would flicker and turn off of their own accord, only to find a patient dead in the morning. Spooky stuff, you know? But there was one story that always got to me. The omen of death. Allegedly, some nights, only nights mind you, would you see a big black dog. I had recently finished watching the Harry Potter movies, and it reminded me a lot of the omen given to Harry of the black dog. I asked if he had just taken this from the book, but he swore up and down that this was true, that even other members of the team had seen this before, and this care home was by no means new, and it was very likely that it had been around a while, and other members of the staff would have seen it. In any case, the story goes a little bit like this, that when someone is about to die, the black dog will appear and stand near their room, sometimes in their room, sometimes outside their room. But near their room, the black dog will be. When someone sees it, it is as quick to disappear as you saw it, and that the very next day, death is guaranteed. Quite spooky to say the least. We joked around with it, but I am 100% not into the paranormal, or at least wasn't, and didn't give this any creed. As you can expect with any care home, people come and go relatively quickly. We have some residents that stick around a while and are great fun, and it's always very sad when they leave for the last time. One evening, after I'd been working there about 2 years, I hadn't thought of the black dog in a long time. It had popped up in conversations here and there, but I just brushed it away and ignored it. I was visiting Cecil, one of our older residents, who had actually been there longer than I had. She was a lovely soul. I just did my routine check, made sure she was all good in bed, and carried on for the night. When I realized I didn't have my phone in my pocket, and thought, oh crap, if I'd left it in Cecil's room and it vibrates, it's gonna wake her up. So I started making my way back, looked around outside, and peered into the room through the glass. It was right there on the chair. I quietly opened the door, hoping not to disturb her, and went around and picked up my phone, quickly put it on mute, and started making my way out. The door opens inwards, and just as I opened the door, did I see a black dog. It was right there in the doorway. It growled at me, and just as quickly as I had seen it did it vanish. I just about pooped my pants, and in my fear, I let go of the door, which shut with a bang. I turn around, assuming that Cecil would wake up at this and deeply needing to apologize, but she didn't stir. Remembering the tale that Brian had told me previously, I just thought I'd check on Cecil to be safe. I approached her bed and listened intently, just to see if she was breathing, but I didn't hear anything. I then established rather quickly that Cecil had expired some moments ago, no doubt. Cecil had just been talking to me, all fine, very shortly ago, so I was quite shocked that she had gone in such an unexpected manner. But that was it. She was out. I saw the black dog only one more time before I quit working there. Another time, I was working the night shift again, and I was just finishing up my rounds. It was approaching 4 a.m. now, and I was very keen to go home. I'm just prepping all the necessary paperwork for the handover for the day shift team. And I'm just doing a final sweep, just to make sure everyone is still in their bed, when the black dog is again outside a room. This time it doesn't growl, it doesn't move. It just gives a little nod of its head in acknowledgement and vanishes into the air. My gut drops, and I know that this person has met their end. I quietly open the room, hoping that my eyes were just deceiving me. And when I look, the person is definitely gone. Their skin is ice cold. They must have been dead a while, I think. Possibly many hours. With a great sigh, I realize that the dog story is true. And the next day, when I have a conversation with Brian, I admit to him that now I had seen the dog twice. He gives a hearty laugh and tells me that it was true. He gives a hearty laugh and says of course it's true. And he makes a joke, saying that he hopes he doesn't see it outside my house door anytime soon. We laugh, and in a few months' time, I quit, for reasons unrelated to the paranormal, mostly poor staff management. I'll miss Brian though. In any case, it's definitely made me a believer, but I truly hope not to see that black dog anytime again soon. When you work as a nurse, you see it all. You have to become accustomed to dealing with death, as it's very likely that it will happen on your watch, especially when you work in a care home like I do. I've had lots of people come and go, but one of the creepiest and most common things that happens is talking to relatives that have already passed when you're about to go. Such was the case with a dear friend of mine, Thomas. He had lost his wife many years ago. He was also semi-lucid at times, but for the most part just babbled. He had dementia. He had no family left. He and his wife had 3 children, but they had all died tragically and horribly during their lives. It pains me, but no parent should have to bury their children, especially not all 3. He was very lonely, which is why I grew attached to him, because he was a kind and sweet old man. He'd tell me stories of his children, of his wife, and of how wonderful they all were. He even got teared up when he told me about how his children had met their end. They had all gotten very sick, and, well, they died. It was one of these nights when I was doing my rounds, when I just went into his room to wish him good night and told him that it was time for bed. He gave me a smile and said, "I don't think I'm going to sleep tonight." I asked him what he meant. I looked at my watch and it was already 10:30, which was plenty late for Thomas, who usually slept around 9. He gave me another smile. "I'm going to make my exit now. The curtain has fallen." He was a theatre actor, you see, and liked using this terminology a lot. We got a hoot out of it, me and the other nurses. I gave him a confused look. "What do you mean you're on your way out?" "My kids are here, and my wife. They're here to pick me up. I'm going to take the bus now." I gave him another confused look. What the hell was he talking about? And then it all clicked. He was seeing the ghosts of his family. He gave me another smile when he saw my face dawn with comprehension. "That's right, girlie. It's time for me to go. You scoot along now. I hope I don't see you anytime soon." And he gave a chuckle. I gave a little smile in response. "You silly man," I thought. Then I walked out the room, gave him a little pat on the shoulder, and said I'd be back in half an hour, and expected him to be asleep. Half-hour later, I'm still finishing up some paperwork, and push it for 45 minutes before I go check up on him. When I do, I see he's soundly asleep, but just think I better nip in to check on him, to make sure he's okay. I quietly open the door, and go and see if he's still breathing. And he's gone. Just like he said his family was here. As you can imagine, I was pretty creeped out. And just as I was about to leave the room to do what we need to do when someone passes away, do I hear a whisper behind my ear, "Thanks for everything, girlie." I turn around, thinking that he must still be alive, with a huge surge of relief washing over me. When I turn around, he's still dead, on the bed, and hasn't moved. I'm pretty sure he just wanted to wish me one final goodbye, but that sent chills up my spine for the rest of my shift, and left me with a dawning sense of uncomfortableness. It leaves me wondering, though, the mystery of the afterlife, if there even is one, or if that was just his brain playing tricks on him. But why does it happen to so many people? I guess I'll never know, but I suppose one day I'm bound to find out. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed Nursing Home Stories. Brand new topic, never done it before. I really enjoyed it. It was very creepy, to say the least. Nice and spooky stories. That one about the lady who was mutilating herself. Was she possessed? Was she just crazy? I don't know, but it creeped me out plenty. A huge thank you to all my incredible patrons, whose names can be seen on screen, for their regular donations of as little as $1 a month. Really help keep the channel running. Any donation is of course appreciated and comes with rewards. That's right, rewards for donating. All the info regarding that can be seen in the description and on the Patreon page, if you just follow the link, and is always of course incredibly appreciated. Thanks guys. If you liked today's video, don't forget that there will be another video tomorrow, as it is daily posts on this channel for spooky stories every night. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. I know most of you hearing this won't do it, but maybe the fact that I've said you won't do it means you will do it. Who knows? I'll have to wait and see. Alright guys, for now I'm gonna sign off. Stay clear of black dogs that are ghosts, and I'll see you in the next one.